Tonight, I want to give you permission for something almost nobody gives themselves after 60. Permission to be happy, not politely content, not doing fine, thank you for asking. Happy, the real kind, the kind that surprises you in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, living alone, exactly as you choose. Pull your chair a little closer to the fire. Get your tea or your coffee, whatever's keeping your hands warm tonight. Because what I want to talk about tonight is something the world gets almost completely backwards. Society looks at a woman over 60 living by herself, and it assumes immediately, automatically, that she must be lonely, that she must be missing something, that surely, deep down, she'd rather have someone else's schedule to build her day around, someone else's preferences deciding what's for dinner, someone else's noise filling up the rooms. And I understand why the assumption exists. For most of our lives, a full house was the measure of a full life. A ringing phone meant you mattered. A quiet home meant something was wrong. We were taught that lesson so early and so thoroughly that most of us never even questioned it. We just carried it forward, decade after decade, right into a season of life it was never actually built for. But here's what I've come to believe, and what I think so many of you have already quietly discovered for yourselves, even if you haven't said it out loud. Living alone after 60 is not the sad ending everyone assumes it is. For a great many women, it is the beginning of the happiest, most fully theirs chapter they have ever lived. And there is real psychological truth behind that, not just wishful thinking. Carl Jung, who spent his whole career studying what a full human life actually requires, wrote something that I think about often, that the second half of life is not meant to be a slow, fading copy of the first half. It is meant to be its own complete season with its own purpose, and that purpose has almost nothing to do with how full your house is. None of this is your fault. By the way, the fact that you might still feel a flicker of guilt or worry about enjoying your own company this much. You were raised in a world that measured a woman's worth by how much she gave away of herself. So if some part of you feels like it needs to apologize for being content alone, I want you to set that down right now, at least for the next few minutes, and just listen. You've noticed it too, I think. The freedom of deciding dinner is whatever you feel like eating, at whatever time you feel like eating it, with nobody's face falling because it wasn't what they wanted. The quiet luxury of a Saturday morning that belongs entirely to you. No one to ask where you're going. No one's mood to read before you've even had your coffee. You've caught yourself more than once smiling at something small and thinking, almost guiltily, I actually love this. And then right behind that thought came the other one, the worry about what people think. The sister-in-law who keeps suggesting you should get out more. The neighbor who tilts her head with that particular expression of pity every time she mentions how quiet your house must be. The well-meaning children who call to check if you're doing okay being all alone out there, as if alone were automatically the same thing as suffering. I want to be honest with you about something before we go any further, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort tonight. Solitude and loneliness are not the same experience wearing two different names. They can look identical from the outside. The same quiet house, the same single place setting at the table, the same evening spent without another voice in the room. But on the inside, they are almost opposites. Loneliness is an ache for a connection you don't have. Solitude is a fullness you've built for yourself, on purpose, out of your own choices. And so much of what other people assume is loneliness in your life is actually solitude. They simply don't know how to recognize because they've never experienced it themselves. If you've stayed with me this far, what comes next was written with you specifically in mind, because I don't think this is an abstract idea for you. I think you already live somewhere inside this question most days, even if you've never had the words for it before tonight. Because here's the harder truth underneath the comforting one, and I don't want to rush past it. Before I tell you why so many women find their happiest years living exactly as they choose, there's something else you need to understand first, why the discomfort other people feel about your solitude isn't really about you at all. Let's sit with that a moment. Because I think once you understand what's actually happening when someone worries about you living alone, you'll stop absorbing it as truth about your life and start recognizing it for what it actually is. When your sister or your old friend from church or even your own children express concern about you being alone, genuinely, sincerely, sometimes even with tears in their eyes, I don't think they are usually reacting to evidence that you are suffering. Most of the time, they are reacting to their own fear of what solitude would feel like for them. This is something Jung wrote about at length. This idea of projection, the way we take feelings we can't quite face in ourselves and lay them, without meaning to, onto someone else. Your daughter may look at your quiet house and feel a wave of fear about her own future, about what happens to her when her children are grown and gone, and without realizing it, she hands that fear to you, dressed up as concern for your well-being. Your old friend, still measuring her own worth by whether her phone rings, may look at your peaceful evening and feel unsettled by how content you seem, because it quietly challenges everything she's built her own identity around. None of this means their concern is fake or that they don't love you. It usually means the opposite, that they love you enough to imagine themselves in your life, and what they're imagining frightens them, because it isn't a life they've learned how to want yet. But their fear is not a verdict on your happiness. It is simply their fear, wearing your name. I think of a woman who told me her son calls every Sunday evening, without fail, always starting the conversation the same worried way. How are you doing out there, all by yourself? As though she were stranded somewhere, instead of simply living her own life exactly as she chooses. She said for years she'd rushed to reassure him, listing off her book club, her garden, her weekly lunch with a friend, almost like presenting evidence in a trial she hadn't agreed to be part of. And then one Sunday, she told me, she simply said, "I'm happy, sweetheart, truly." And she stopped there. No list, no defense, just the plain sentence, allowed to stand on its own. She said the silence on the other end of the phone lasted a good 3 seconds, and then he said quietly, almost surprised, "Okay, good." That was the whole exchange. It was enough. You might be telling yourself that if you truly enjoyed being alone, you wouldn't ever feel that flicker of loneliness on a hard evening, the kind that comes at 9 o'clock when the house feels a little too still and a little too big. But that isn't true, and I don't want you thinking it is. Even the fullest solitude has evenings like that. The difference isn't the absence of every hard moment, it's what those moments mean about your whole life. A single quiet evening that aches a little doesn't undo a life you've built with intention. It's simply weather passing through a house you otherwise love living in. There's a concept Jung wrote about that I think explains something else many of you have felt, but never quite named the almost surprising happiness that shows up after a long stretch of genuine loneliness, sometimes seemingly out of nowhere. He called it enantiodromia, the idea that when something is pushed to its furthest extreme, it has a tendency to turn into its opposite. A woman who spends years genuinely aching with loneliness, who does the hard, unglamorous work of learning to sit with herself, to comfort herself, to build a life that doesn't depend on anyone else walking through the door, that woman often arrives, almost without noticing the exact moment it happened, at a solitude so rich it becomes something close to joy. The very thing that once hollowed her out becomes, eventually, the thing that fills her up. Not because the loneliness was secretly good, but because moving all the way through it, honestly, taught her how to be her own company in a way most people never learn. I think about a woman who wrote to me not long ago. She told me that for the first 2 years after her divorce, she dreaded evenings, the way some people dread a dentist's chair, that particular tightening in the chest as the light started to fade, knowing another long stretch of silence was coming. She said she used to leave the television on for company, even when she wasn't watching it, just to have another voice in the house. And then, she wrote, something shifted. She couldn't point to the exact week, but one evening, she turned the television off on purpose, made herself a proper dinner, sat at her own table, and ate slowly, savoring it, and realized halfway through the meal that she felt something she hadn't expected to feel in that house ever again. Peace. Not the absence of sadness, something sturdier than that. She said it felt like coming home to herself after a very long trip. What happened for her next isn't what you might expect, and I promise we'll get to it, because it matters for understanding what real change in this area actually looks like. But first, I want to talk about the part of this that Jung considered central to the whole second half of life, because I think it's the missing piece in almost every conversation about women living alone. He called it individuation, the lifelong process of becoming fully, authentically yourself, underneath every role you were ever asked to play. For most of your life, you were somebody's daughter, somebody's wife, somebody's mother, somebody's coworker, somebody's neighbor who always brought a dish to the potluck. Every one of those roles asked something specific of you, and you gave it, often beautifully, often at real cost to parts of yourself that had to wait their turn. Jung believed that the true task of the second half of life is finally turning toward those waiting parts, not abandoning the people you love. That's an important distinction. And I don't want you to hear this as permission to disappear from your family, but turning toward yourself, finally, as someone worth knowing on your own terms, not only through what you provide for everyone else. Living alone, for so many women, becomes the very stage on which that turning happens. Not because other people are the enemy of individuation, but because for the first time in decades, there's enough quiet to actually hear yourself. What do you actually want for dinner when nobody else's preference is in the room? What show do you actually enjoy when nobody else is waiting for their turn with the remote? What does your own voice sound like when it isn't shaped every hour of every day around someone else's needs? This isn't selfishness. It's the slow, patient work of finally meeting yourself, the way Jung believed every person is meant to, sometime before the story ends. There's a shadow side to this conversation too, and I don't want to skip past it, because dignity means being honest about the hard parts, not just the comforting ones. For some women, the early stretch of living alone genuinely does carry grief. Grief for a marriage that ended, grief for a house that used to be loud with children, grief for a version of life you thought you'd be living by now. That grief is real, and it deserves to be honored, not rushed past with forced positivity. If tonight's video finds you in that raw early stretch, please hear this clearly. I am not telling you to feel happy on command, and I am never here to hand out easy affirmations that skip over real pain. What I am telling you is that grief and eventual peace are not enemies standing on opposite sides of some line you have to cross all at once. They can, and often do, live in the same season, the same week, sometimes the same evening. And moving through the grief honestly, rather than around it, is very often exactly what opens the door to the peace on the other side. You might be telling yourself that your situation is different, that other women simply adjust more easily, that something about your particular loss or your particular circumstances makes this kind of peace unlikely for you specifically. I want to gently push back on that thought. It isn't true. The women who eventually find this kind of contentment are not a special, luckier category of person. They are simply women who kept living their ordinary days, kept setting their own table, kept choosing themselves in small ways, long enough for the season to turn. By the end of tonight, I think something in your chest is going to feel a little steadier about this, whether you're deep into loving your own company already or still somewhere in the harder early stretch of learning how. Let's get there, together. Here's what I want you to understand about the freedoms so many women rediscover in this season, because I don't think they get named nearly often enough, and naming them matters. There is the freedom of your own schedule belonging entirely to you waking when your body wants to wake, not when someone else's habits demand it. There is the freedom of a home that reflects only your own taste. Finally, after decades of compromise over furniture and paint colors, and whose family photos went where. There is the freedom of silence that isn't awkward because there's no one in the room it needs to be filled for. There is the freedom of a Sunday afternoon spent exactly how you want it spent, without narrating your choices to anyone or defending them. I rearranged my own living room furniture a while back, entirely on my own terms, in a way I never would have while I was married, and never quite got around to doing in the years right after either. I moved the good reading chair directly in front of the window, where the afternoon light falls just right for an hour every day, even though it meant the room technically looked a little unbalanced by anyone else's standards. Nobody had to approve it. Nobody had an opinion about whether the chair blocked a walkway that, frankly, nobody but me was walking through anyway. I sat in that chair for the first time with the afternoon sun on my hands and felt something so small and so enormous at once. The simple, quiet satisfaction of a home finally arranged around exactly what I wanted, with no one else's comfort to weigh against my own. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I'd made a decision that size purely for myself. That's such a small thing to describe out loud. And yet I think so many of you know exactly the feeling I mean, because you've had your own version of that chair by that window. Maybe it was choosing paint you actually loved instead of the safe neutral color everyone else preferred. Maybe it was finally clearing out a closet that had been someone else's for years and filling it at last entirely with your own things. Maybe it was simply eating standing at the counter some difficult evenings and then, later, choosing on purpose to sit down properly at your own table again for no one but yourself because you decided you were worth setting a nice place for. Now let's talk honestly about how to answer the people who worry about you, because I know that's one of the hardest parts of living happily alone. Not the solitude itself, which so many of you have already made peace with, but everyone else's discomfort about your peace. You don't owe anyone an elaborate defense of your own contentment. You don't have to convince your sister-in-law or your college roommate or even your own children that you're truly fine. That impulse to over-explain, to produce evidence, to list all the reasons your life is full, that impulse usually comes from an old automatic guilt that has nothing to do with the truth of your days. Jung would have called that automatic guilt a complex and emotional pattern, so practiced it fires before you've even decided to feel it. A reflex left over from a lifetime of measuring your worth by how well you served everyone else's comfort. You are allowed to simply say, gently and without apology, I'm genuinely happy. I love my life exactly as it is. You don't need to add 3 qualifiers to soften it, or a joke to make it more palatable. You can let that sentence stand on its own, the same way you'd let any other true thing stand on its own. And if someone pushes back, if they insist you must be lonely even after you've told them you're not, you are allowed to simply hold your own truth without needing them to agree with it. Their discomfort is theirs to sit with. Your peace does not require their permission. There is a harder version of this too, and I want to name it honestly rather than skip past it. Sometimes the people who worry loudest about you being alone are not actually worried about your happiness at all. They are uncomfortable because your contentment quietly disrupts a family story they've been telling themselves. A story where you needed rescuing, where your life was somehow smaller without a husband or without children underfoot every day. If that's your situation, please hear this clearly. You are not required to shrink your joy to make anyone else's narrative feel true. You can love them, stay close to them, keep the door of your relationship open with warmth, and still refuse to perform sadness you don't actually feel, simply because it would make someone else more comfortable. I promise we're getting to the hopeful part now, the part where all of this settles into something you can actually carry with you tonight. But first, one more thing worth understanding, because I think it explains why this particular happiness feels so different from any contentment you might have known earlier in life. Jung believed the psyche has a remarkable capacity, which he called the transcendent function, to take 2 things that seem to contradict each other, grief and peace, solitude and fullness, an ending and a beginning, and quietly fuse them into something entirely new, something neither piece could have become on its own. The happiness so many women discover living alone after 60 isn't the absence of everything that came before it. It's the fusion of all of it. The marriage, the children, the loneliness, the grief, the slow learning, into a version of peace that could only have been built from exactly that particular life, your particular life, and no one else's. So something is already shifting for you, even tonight, even if you can't quite name it yet. Maybe it's a small softening around the guilt you've carried about enjoying your own company. Maybe it's the first flicker of letting yourself simply say, I'm happy, out loud, without immediately following it with an explanation nobody asked for. Whatever it is, I think you felt it somewhere in the last few minutes, and I don't think that's an accident. I want you to picture something with me for a moment, just for the length of a breath or two. Picture an ordinary evening in your own home, exactly as it is right now, or exactly as you'd like it to become. The lamp is on in the corner you love best. There's something warm in your hands. Tea or coffee or nothing at all, just your own hands resting quietly in your lap. The house is quiet, but it's a quiet that feels like a held note in a piece of music you actually enjoy, not an empty space waiting to be filled. You are not waiting for the phone to ring to feel complete. You are not measuring the evening by who else might have been there. You are simply fully here, in a life you built, on your own terms, one ordinary decision at a time. The chair moved to the window, the dinner made exactly how you like it, the silence finally sounding like peace instead of absence. Somewhere nearby, maybe a clock is ticking, or a kettle is just beginning to sigh toward a boil, or the last of the evening light is sliding low across the floor in that particular amber way it does in early autumn. None of it is dramatic. None of it needs to be. That's rather the whole point of it. An evening so unremarkable to anyone watching from outside, and so quietly, completely yours from the inside. That evening is not a fantasy. For so many of you, it is already closer than you think. And for some of you, it is already exactly the evening you are living tonight. Here is what I want you to actually do, starting tonight, not as an assignment, but as a small act of honesty with yourself. The next time someone expresses worry about you being alone, I want you to pause before you rush to reassure them. Just pause and ask yourself quietly, is this actually loneliness I'm feeling, or is this simply solitude that someone else doesn't know how to recognize? Sit with the answer, whatever it is, without judging yourself for it either way. And if the honest answer is that you are, in fact, deeply and genuinely happy, let yourself say so plainly the next time it comes up, without softening it into something smaller to make somebody else more comfortable. If this is your life right now, living alone and quietly, privately happier than anyone assumes you should be, I would love to know. What's the best part of it for you? Is it the schedule that belongs entirely to you? The home arranged exactly to your own taste? The silence that finally sounds like peace instead of absence? Tell me in the comments, because I read every single one, and I think there are so many women watching tonight who need to hear that they're not the only one who feels this way. And if you're watching this tonight with a cup of tea or coffee, going a little cold beside you, curled up in your own favorite chair, in your own home, arranged exactly how you like it, tell me where you're watching from. I love knowing where all of you are, sitting by your own fires while I sit by mine. You are so far from the only woman feeling exactly this tonight. There is nothing broken about a full, happy life that happens to include a quiet house. Tell me I'm not alone in believing that, and let's remind each other, together, in the comments. What's one thing tonight made you think about a little differently about your own solitude, your own home, your own quiet evenings? I would love to know. Before we say goodnight, let me leave you with this. So many of you came here tonight half expecting me to tell you that living alone was something to be endured, something to grieve, something to eventually fix. Instead, I hope what you're leaving with is permission, real permission, the kind you give yourself instead of waiting for someone else to hand it to you, to simply be happy, exactly as you are, in the life you have actually built. Come back and sit with me again tomorrow night. There is more I want to share with you, more evenings by this fire. I'd love for us to spend together whatever season you happen to be living through when you find your way back here. You are not broken for loving your own company. You are not selfish for wanting your home arranged around your own peace. And you are not, in any way that matters, alone tonight, not really. Not with all of us sitting by our own fires together, in the quiet, happy company of exactly who we've become.